Story 1. Tony Iommi lost the tips of his ring and middle fingers on his right hand in a sheet metal accident at age 17. Told he would likely never play guitar again, as he was left-handed and injured his fretboard hand, Tony fashioned his own homemade thimbles and learned to play again. Not having full sensation in his fingers, he found it difficult to play, so he tuned his guitar down to loosen the strings, effectively creating the heavy metal sound Black Sabbath would eventually become famous for. Story 2. Barry Marshall believed that ulcers were caused by bacteria but could not obtain ethics approval for human testing. To prove his theory, he ingested Helicobacter pylori bacteria himself and developed ulcers 3 days later, confirming his hypothesis. Story 3. This is very personal for me. My grandfather, who raised me with my grandmother, retired as an engineer. He was bored and saw a need for what was then called mobility equipment. He invented the standing frame in the 1980s. It allowed people with spinal issues such as quadriplegia to transition from lying down to standing up fully, supported and safe without leaving their bed. He made several variations for different sizes and ages, and they were sold all over the world. He said, "No one else was helping, so I did. All of this came from our suburban garage in Sydney, Australia." He was awarded the Order of Australia, one of our country's highest honors. He was my hero. Story 4. In the early 1960s, Ford was interested in purchasing Ferrari and invested a lot of money investigating their finances and facilities. Enzo Ferrari played along but ultimately did not intend to sell to Ford. Instead, he used Ford's interest to negotiate a favorable deal when he eventually sold to Fiat. This deal allowed him to maintain control over Ferrari's racing division. Ford was very upset about having the deal fall through. They realized the only way to upset Enzo Ferrari was to challenge his pride and joy, Ferrari's winning streak at the 24 Hours of Le Mans. Ford committed extensive resources to developing a car to achieve this goal, which resulted in the Ford GT40. Another major incident involving Enzo Ferrari was with Lamborghini's sports car division. Lamborghini was manufacturing tractors and was successful in that business. Ferruccio Lamborghini, who owned a Ferrari sports car, experienced issues with the clutch. Having some mechanical experience, he diagnosed the problem and approached Enzo with suggestions on how to fix it, only to be met with contempt. Angered, Ferruccio decided to build a better sports car than Ferrari. This led to the creation of the Miura and established Lamborghini as a sports car manufacturer. Story 5. Girolamo Cardano was a mathematician in the Renaissance who was trying to find a generalized solution for the roots of cubic functions. One of the problems that kept appearing was that he needed to take the square root of negative numbers, which traditional real number algebra would not allow. Cardano, instead of dismissing it as impossible, decided that these imaginary numbers, as they were called later, must exist. This was an astoundingly controversial opinion at the time. Now we use them every day. Story 6. Maybe not the greatest, but George Lucas wanted to make a Flash Gordon movie. They would not give him the rights, so he wrote his own space opera, created his own special effects company, and became a multi-billionaire by making the highest-grossing movie franchise ever, at least for a while. Story 7. It is not exactly a I-will-do-it-myself situation, but a professor named Richard Scaliver, along with his research partner Georgina Long, developed breakthrough melanoma research and treatments. Last year, Scaliver was diagnosed with grade 4 brain cancer that was incurable. He and his partner developed a new experimental treatment, with Scaliver being the first patient to receive it. A year later, Scaliver appears completely cured with no sign of recurrence of the brain tumor. Story 8. After the death of her husband, Pharaoh Thutmose II, Egypt was supposed to be ruled by her stepson, Thutmose III. However, he was still a child, and Hatshepsut was meant to act as regent until he came of age. Instead of merely serving as regent, Hatshepsut declared herself pharaoh, one of the very few women to do so in ancient Egypt. She ruled for over 20 years, expanded Egypt's trade networks, commissioned grand architectural projects like her famous temple at Deir el-Bahri, and established a period of peace and prosperity. Story 9. Linus Torvalds is a very interesting person. After creating Linux, the operating system running on most servers today, He also created Git, motivated by dissatisfaction with the version control programs available at the time. Git became not only the version control tool for Linux developers, which was his goal, but also the most popular version control tool used by software companies and developers today. Story 10. My vote goes to Dashrath Manji. When his wife died in 1959 after being injured from falling from a mountain, and due to the same mountain blocking easy access to a nearby hospital in time, he decided to carve a 110-meter long, 9.1-meter wide, and 7.7-meter deep path through a ridge of hills using only a hammer and a chisel. Story 11. Sony entered the gaming industry after a failed partnership with Nintendo on a CD add-on. The rest is the history of one of the best-selling home video game consoles, PlayStation. Story 12. Napoleon escaped from prison and persuaded the opposing army to join his side. Story 13. You know that old wives' tale about how cracking your knuckles will cause arthritis? Dr. Donald Unger decided to test that theory in the most extreme way he could. Once a day for 50 years, he cracked the knuckles in his left hand but not in his right hand. Neither hand developed arthritis, thus disproving the old wives' tale. 50 years, people. The dedication is impressive. Story 14. After the mutiny on the Bounty, Captain Bligh was set in a rowboat at sea off Madagascar, with a jug of water and some hardtack biscuits. The boatswain rowed himself back to England to bring the mutineers up on charges. Story 15. The group of elderly people who tunneled under the Berlin Wall because they were told to leave. I recall this exhibit from the Checkpoint Charlie Museum about 20 years ago. There was a group of elderly Germans who lived on the east side of the wall, quite near it. They sought help from someone who ran escape routes to the west and did a lot of tunneling. He basically told them, "No, you're too old and useless to help me." They were not having it. They set out to make their own tunnel. They devised their own system of signals and codes with the planting of flowers. Each person had a role, from digging to dirt dispersal to managing the planting signals. The best part is that they made their tunnel tall enough so they could all walk through instead of having to crawl, as would have been the case with the other person's tunnel. Story 16. I can only remember one moment from my personal history. I was part of the last generation in my country required to complete mandatory military service. Apparently, my generation is considered particularly lazy. We were supposed to pass a certain obstacle course and complete it within a set time. Almost nobody could do it, and everyone complained that it was an elite target that obviously could not be reached. We were stunned when the officer, a chubby man in his 50s, completed the entire course with a mixture of rage and disappointment in our performance, finishing easily a minute faster than any of us. He did not say a word afterward, nor did we. No one ever questioned him again. If he said it was possible after that demonstration. Story 17. Leo Major liberates Zwolle by himself out of sheer rage and spite. He went to scout out German soldiers and decided to do this alone. One man versus approximately 200 to 300 German soldiers. Story 18. I have bought some of the most famous Gran Turismo cars, he would later say, and in each of these magnificent machines I have found some faults. Too hot, uncomfortable, not sufficiently fast, or not perfectly finished. Now I want to make a Gran Turismo car without faults. A perfect car. In 1963, Ferruccio founded Automobili Lamborghini, employing a talented team that included Giampaolo Dallara, Paolo Stanzani, and New Zealander Bob Wallace. With Giotto Bizzarini as a consultant, Lamborghini built his factory on farmland in Sant'Agata Bolognese, an easy commute for the skilled workers employed by Ferrari and Maserati in nearby Medina. Story 19. Maria Oktyabrskaya. After her husband was killed fighting Nazis in 1941, Oktyabrskaya sold her possessions to donate a tank for the war effort and requested to drive it herself. She was trained to operate and repair a T-34 medium tank, which she named Fighting Girlfriend. Oktyabrskaya demonstrated her skill and bravery in battle and was promoted to the rank of sergeant. After she died of wounds sustained in battle in 1944, she was posthumously awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest honor for bravery during combat in the Soviet Union. She was the first female tank driver to receive this title. Story 20. John Brown tried to end slavery with an army mostly made up of his immediate family members. Story 21. Lamborghini. The company originally made tractors. The owner bought a Ferrari and was unhappy with it. He went to Ferrari with his concerns and was dismissed, so he made his own. Story 22. I don't know if this fits, but I feel like it deserves an honorable mention. Teresa Kachindamoto, the paramount chief of the Dedza district in Malawi, is renowned for her courageous efforts to eradicate child marriage in her community. Since taking office, she has dissolved over 3,500 child marriages, sending each of those children back to school. Kachinamoto's forceful action in dissolving child marriages and insisting on education for both girls and boys has been met with both praise and criticism. Despite receiving death threats and backlash from some community members, she has remained committed to her cause. She is now lobbying the government to increase the marriageable age to 21. In a country with one of the highest rates of child marriage in the world, Kachinamoto's efforts have made a significant difference. According to reports, she has stopped around 850 child marriages in just 3 years and over 300 in a single month. Her work has inspired a community-wide shift towards prioritizing education and protecting children's rights. Story 23. My vote is Alex Zanardi, former Formula One and Championship Auto Racing Teams racer. Back in 2001, he returned to Championship Auto Racing Teams and got in an accident that caused another car to shear the nose off his. If you're unfamiliar with the body plan of this kind of car, that doesn't sound like much, but these are low, open-wheel vehicles and the nose contains the driver's legs. He suffered traumatic amputation of both legs, one at and one above his knee. They had to amputate more to clean and close the wounds, lost 3/4 of his blood volume, and woke up after the crash a double amputee. Most people would say, "Wow, I am lucky to be alive after such a crash. I should probably take it easy and make the most of the rest of my life and stay away from cars after one tore my legs off." But Alex Zanardi is not most people. As soon as he was healed and fitted with prosthetics, he started trying to drive again, found all the prosthetics insufficient for driving, and ended up learning about and designing his own prosthetics to his own standards to facilitate getting himself back behind the wheel of a car and on a track again. He was able to get back in a Championship Auto Racing Team's vehicle to ceremonially finish the race he was nearly killed in 2003, moved on to racing again in Touring Series later that year, and has been racing in various ways until recently. This includes continuing with hand cycling, which he picked up in 2001 while recovering from the amputations, competing in the Paralympic Games, winning multiple gold and silver medals, completing marathons, and setting records in the process. Unfortunately, in 2020, he suffered a second serious accident while hand cycling during a road race, where he lost control and went face first into an oncoming truck. He survived again. As of 2022, he is back home and continuing to recover. There is no word on whether he will resume racing once recovered. Incredible man. On a non-racing note, the man has the weirdest luck. In the middle of 2022, he was hospitalized again from a house fire and survived once more. It is unclear if he was actually injured. The hospitalization was listed as due to fire-damaged equipment he needs to live. So it may have just been the only place that had the necessary equipment, and he was not further hurt. Something really has it out for him, and something else will not let him die. Story 24. Old friend who removed his own appendix in Antarctica. Or the Australian nurse working in remote areas who treated his own ST segment elevation myocardial infarction. STEMI. Story 25. The Wright brothers actually set out to build a working heavier-than-air flying machine themselves and never expected anyone else to do it for them. They originally believed they could rely on other people's knowledge and research for multiple things, such as airfoils, propellers, and engines. They soon found out they could not. So they built their own wind tunnel to research airfoils and later propellers, enabling them to build wings that could generate lift and propellers that would effectively propel the aircraft forward. After discovering that nobody had ever considered building a lightweight engine, they figured out how to build one themselves. They developed a warping trailing edge for their wings to control the roll movement of the aircraft, though similar functionality, now universally known as aileron, had been invented by others before them. Still, they appear to be the first to seriously consider the need for three-axis control for aircraft. Then they flew their own contraption, which may have been necessary because it was so complicated to keep in the air. One had to know it intimately to have any hope of keeping it flying even for 12 seconds. Nobody had considered organized training of pilots yet, so shortly after, the Wright brothers established a flight school. Story 26. Maybe not in history, but in my own life, it's an example that still makes me smile. I'm disabled. I wear a leg brace on my right leg and use elbow crutches. In second grade, we were playing Capture the Flag, and somehow I had gotten to the circle where the flag was on the opposing side. No one bothered to guard me or even watch the flag. I stuffed the flag in my pocket and scooted as fast as I could past the line to safety. A few seconds later, confusion erupted. All eyes were on me as I slowly pulled the long red piece of fabric out of my pocket with the flourish of a magician pulling out a silk handkerchief. My entire team erupted in cheers. I was the hero of the day. Story 27, very personal to me, and not one that has an impact on the world as a whole, but completely changed my world. The longtime former best friend of my ex. What feels like many years ago, when I was a teen, I was in an abusive relationship. I was subjected to abuse in every form, every day for just over 2 years. One day, his best friend burst through the door of our kitchen with a piece of wood and hit my ex around the head with it. As he was brutalizing me with an object, ice, and a kettle of boiling water. Unbeknownst to me, his best friend had started picking up on little red flags, which he eventually decided put me at risk of verbal abuse and possibly isolation from others, so he decided to help me. It turned out he had spent months trying to get help for me from outside agencies, but nobody would help without hard evidence, so he decided to get me out himself. Only the day before, he had been visiting us to study with my ex, and he asked my ex where I was. When he answered vaguely, he asked to see me because he thought I could advise on a love interest of his. My ex barked at me to come to them, and then told me to say I was fine, which I did before scurrying off. I had left the room, but apparently my ex made a joke about keeping me in check, and later made another joke about how the kitchen was not only where I belonged as a woman, but was the room that held the items needed to ensure I did as I was told. On his way out, my ex's best friend actually set my laptop, which he had taken from the kitchen table, up in a high, glass-fronted cabinet in our large kitchen, then connected using his laptop so that he could see what was going on. The next morning, he saw my ex being verbally abusive and thought he had what he needed, but wanted to see what else happened. He went on some time later to see the escalation and the beginning of that day's abuse, and the rest is history. That person saved my life and changed my entire world. I am now happily married with 2 adorable children because of him. The best part? The friend and I never liked each other, had nothing in common, and to this day are not particularly close friends. But none of that mattered to him. All that mattered was that I was safe. While we are not close friends as such, we do share a deep connection, and our families meet throughout the year for casual meetings and for our children to play. He is godfather to both of my children because I know he will always look out for them if I cannot for any reason. Story 28. Well, he probably did not say forget it, but Georges Lemaitre was a Belgian priest and astronomer who developed what is now known as the Big Bang Theory. He attended the famous 1927 Solvay conference, and while he was still fresh off earning his Doctor of Philosophy degree, he managed to talk to Albert Einstein about his idea of an expanding universe that started with a singularity. He was a young upstart among some of the greatest minds of the age, including Marie Curie, Niels Bohr, Werner Heisenberg, and Paul Dirac. Einstein was dismissive of his notion, saying, "From the point of view of physics, this seems to me abominable." Lemaitre was correct, of course, and years later Einstein had to admit that he was wrong. Story 29. When the National Aeronautics and Space Administration ignored Katherine Johnson's calculations, she rechecked all the math herself, ensuring John Glenn's spaceflight was a success. Absolute legend. Story 30. In 1940, Polish army officer and Polish resistance soldier Witold Pilecki volunteered to be captured by the German occupier and placed in Auschwitz concentration camp in order to infiltrate it. He successfully organized a resistance movement inside, collected extensive intelligence on Nazi atrocities, and escaped in 1943. In 1944, he fought in the Warsaw Uprising. He did not accept the Soviet occupation of Poland and remained loyal to the Polish government in exile based in London. He returned to Poland after the war in 1945 to report on the situation there. Sadly, He was arrested in 1947 by Communist Poland's secret police, tortured, and executed in 1948. Story 31. I cannot remember her name, but I read about a woman who wanted to start her own online college but could not get accreditation from any recognized body in the United States. She then founded her own accrediting body, which she did successfully. Naturally, the first institution it awarded accreditation to was her online college. Story 32. Sir Isaac Newton thought bisecting polygons with extremely high numbers of sides, for example 2 to the power of 62 sides, was inefficient for calculating pi. Therefore, he used his and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz's newly invented calculus to drastically increase the efficiency of calculating pi to an arbitrary number of decimal places. Story 33. Master Sergeant Roy Benavidez. In Vietnam, he was a United States Army Special Forces soldier, and one day in 1968, he heard over the radio that a patrol of 12 Special Forces and 9 Montagnard soldiers were surrounded by a North Vietnamese Army battalion. Benavidez jumped on a helicopter, armed only with a knife, to help his comrades. He ended up saving 8 of them, killed several North Vietnamese Army soldiers, and sustained numerous injuries and wounds from the enemy. In the end, he had 37 separate bullet, bayonet, and shrapnel wounds and lost consciousness on the way back to base. Mistaken for being dead, he was placed in a body bag, but as it was being zipped up by the doctor, he managed to spit in the doctor's face to prove he was alive. In 1981, President Ronald Reagan presented Master Sergeant Roy Benavidez with the Medal of Honor and said, "If the story of his heroism were a movie script, you would not believe it. After all that, respiratory complications stemming from diabetes were the only things that could kill Benavidez when he died at the age of 63 in 1998. Story 34. While not world-changing, my wife had cancer and was hospitalized for months due to a life-threatening infection. There were many aspects of her care that I did not like. She eventually recovered, but her doctors said she would have gastrointestinal problems and likely cancer for the rest of her life. I wanted her to receive better care than she had before, so I quit being an engineer, went back to school, and became a registered nurse. A few years later, she cheated on me with a coworker who posted on social media about dinosaurs on Noah's Ark. Story 35. That time when this man's son was born with adrenoleukodystrophy, an incurable and devastating disease. All of the doctors he and his wife consulted said he would have a short and difficult life. So they studied neurochemistry, developed their own treatment, and began modestly funding research. Their treatment was effective in dramatically slowing the progression of the disease, but unfortunately, their son was already quite advanced by the time they developed it. Story 36. Charles Goose got mad at Coca-Cola for not giving him discounts on syrup, so he bought Pepsi. Pepsi went from bankrupt to millions in sales in the 1930s because of him. He was not a good person, but really knew how to deliver a strong message. I also love Pepsi. Story 37. Leo Major. During the summer of 1944, while on a solo reconnaissance mission, he spotted 2 German soldiers nearby. Without hesitation, he killed one and captured the other. Then he went after their commanding officer and a whole German garrison, taking down a few more soldiers along the way. Even under fire from other Germans, he kept moving and, on his own, managed to capture 93 German soldiers. In 1945, Leo was hit by a landmine while in a truck, breaking his back, ribs, and both ankles. They told him he would be discharged. Leo didn't care. He snuck out of the field hospital, stayed with a Dutch family until he recovered, and then made his way back to his battalion. He volunteered to scout out the city of Zwolle and, once he set off, decided he would take the city himself. He convinced a German soldier to deliver a message to the German forces, then spent the night causing havoc around the city. He fired shots, threw grenades, captured soldiers, and cleared out the SS building. His strategy worked so well that the Germans thought the entire Canadian army was invading. By morning, the town was empty of Germans, and the Canadian army entered without opposition. It literally took him one night. Fun fact, he also had an eye patch. He lost his eye earlier because of a grenade but decided he could still be a sniper. Story 38. General Pikolov in the HBO Chernobyl series drove the lead shielded truck mounted with a high-range dosimeter to obtain an accurate reading of the radiation levels. Clad lived until 2003. Story 39. The person who invented the cell phone called his competitor to tell him he succeeded. Story 40. United States Army Colonel Lewis Millet. That remarkable soldier's entire career was one long series of extraordinary stories. He led so many bayonet charges in the Korean War that he had to be given a direct order to stop, even though every one of them was a huge success. He drove away a truck on fire full of ammunition to save his unit. He technically earned the Medal of Honor more than once. Here is a more humorous summary of his life if you are interested. Story 41. Well, I got tired of waiting for contractors to give me a bid on building my house. It was either very expensive or a year out. So I said, forget it, I'll do it myself. And I did. Story 42. Leonid Rogozov diagnosed himself with acute appendicitis while on an expedition in Antarctica in 1961. Being the only doctor on the continent, he performed an appendectomy on himself. That is to say, he cut open his own abdomen, removed the inflamed appendix, sutured himself, and continued his day. Story 43. Horacio Pagani, while working at Lamborghini, suggested that they should buy an autoclave because it would allow them to produce professional lightweight carbon car bodies. Lamborghini refused, so Horacio left Lamborghini, took a bank loan, and bought the machine himself. He started making the bodies and selling them to other automakers, including Lamborghini. In 1992, Horacio Pagani founded Pagani Automobili and began designing and producing his own cars. Story 44. Pedro Serrano. Forget you, Jobu. I do it myself. He hit a home run, carrying his bat with him around the bases to send the Cleveland Indians to the playoffs in the 1988 season. One of the greatest pennant runs in history. Story 45. Zora Arkus-Duntov, General Motors Chevrolet engineer from the 1950s, is the reason the Corvette is a household name. He wanted to race the Corvette at Le Mans because he knew it would be successful. The Le Mans disaster happened in 1955, and every major car company banned racing. Most upheld the ban for only a few years, but General Motors maintained it. Until the 1990s, Duntov could not get official backing from General Motors, so he secretly prepared 3 Corvettes, had someone buy them as a sponsor, and took them to Le Mans in 1960. One car crashed, one had mechanical failure, and the other finished first in its class and 8th overall. He tried again in 1963 with the Grand Sports, but that is another story. Corvette racing is now the most successful single team in Le Mans GT history. For Ford enthusiasts, Henry Ford II wanted to race overseas with Ford but doubted their capability. He heard Ferrari was for sale and tried to strike a deal. During the meeting, Enzo Ferrari called Ford a fat American pig, among other things, and canceled the deal. Ford became angry and contacted a little-known builder named Carroll Shelby. This led to the GT40 and a 1-2-3 win at the 1966 Sierra Leonean Leonsmans, with Ford achieving significant racing success afterward. These are just 2 of many notable car stories. Story 46. When Stanley Martin Lieber created Spider-Man after being told no one would care about a teenage superhero with personal problems. Now, Spider-Man is swinging all over popular culture. Story 47. Dashrath Manji, the Mountain Man, was a laborer from a village in Bihar who undertook an extraordinary journey to carve a path through a treacherous mountain after his wife's tragic death in 1959. Falguni Devi died due to the inefficiency of government services. The nearest clinic was 70 kilometers away, and she could not receive timely medical attention after falling while bringing him lunch. Frustrated by the lack of action from authorities who ignored the community's needs, Manji decided to take matters into his own hands. Over 22 years, using only basic tools, he single-handedly created a 360-foot-long road that reduced travel distance for villagers significantly. Despite facing ridicule and threats from local officials, his determination inspired others to join him. In 1982, he completed the path, which ultimately benefited not just his village but also surrounding areas. Story 48. I know she isn't famous, But my 77-year-old mother drove herself to the hospital in March with bacterial pneumonia and COVID-19 pneumonia at the same time because she couldn't call anyone in the family or the ambulance. That is a pretty good example of I will do it myself. During the first 2 days in the hospital, the doctors and nurses were unsure whether she would survive. If you wanted a famous example, there is the Antarctic scientist and doctor who operated on himself for appendicitis because there was no time to get a rescue operation, and he was the only doctor at the whole station. That was pretty amazing. She did survive. I stayed with her most of July and August this year. Story 49. I cannot remember the family name or details, but the movie Lorenzo's Oil shows how the parents found the cure for their son's condition. Their poor son suffered for years, but they saved many other families from all that pain. Story 50. Veritasium made an excellent video about the man who single-handedly created the blue light-emitting diode. His company pleaded with him to stop and threatened to fire him. He ignored his boss several times and continued to outperform some of the best technology companies such as Panasonic and Sony in the research and development of the blue light-emitting diode, revolutionizing lighting and electronic displays. Story 51. A bit more local to me. Callum MacLeod of the Isle of Rosse, Scotland. After many failed attempts by the locals to have the council build a road, Callum, with a wheelbarrow, shovel, and pick, decided to build the road by himself. He constructed nearly 2 miles of road, and it took him 10 years to complete from 1964 to 1974. It is still there. Story 52. My friend, a realtor with genius-level intellect in her first year at university, had a client who wanted to see a unit in a building. She called the front desk, which was also building management, dozens of times before anyone answered. The woman who answered the phone was very rude and unprofessional. My friend's boyfriend was a software engineer. Together, they spent a few days developing an automated system to fully replace the unprofessional woman. She reached out to the building owner, pitched the system, the woman was fired immediately, and my friend gained access to the unit. Story 53. Story of Paul Irving Pappy Gunn. Pilot in the Philippines during the Second World War. His wife and children were captured and imprisoned by the Japanese, and he spent the rest of the war trying to get them back. He revolutionized air-to-ground warfare during that time. He took airframes and modified them into gunships and test flew them. The reason we have planes like the A-10 Thunderbolt II, also known as the Warthog, is because of this man. Story 54. Greg Jennings carrying the team on his back with a broken leg. Story 55. My wife, when she asked me to do something 4 seconds ago and I have not immediately gotten up to do it. Story 56. My favorite story is about a little, talented, but difficult Italian racing driver named Enzo Ferrari. At the time, he worked for Alfa Romeo, leading their racing team to unprecedented success. However, after a teammate died in a crash, Ferrari lost his passion for driving but kept his passion for racing as a whole. So he formed a supergroup he called his stable, Scuderia, of thoroughbreds. His team drove Alfa Romeo cars under contract until that contract ended in 1933. Ferrari decided that instead of racing Alfa Romeos that he would have to pay for now, or signing up with a different manufacturer, he would make his own cars. However, to pay for them and his racing efforts overall, he would have to make even more cars to sell to the public. One of those early Ferrari cars was sold to a man who ran a tractor company in a town south of Ferrari's hometown of Milan. This customer loved the car. It was a blast to drive, sounded wonderful, handled beautifully, and looked great. There was just one problem: the clutch. He said it felt like it came off one of his tractors. This customer went to Enzo himself to let him know about this. But Ferrari, being difficult as he was, completely dismissed him. In the end, Ferrari told him, "You stick to building tractors, I'll stick to building sports cars," except in Italian, which probably sounded much more insulting. That customer, in response, said, "Fine, I will." That customer's name was Ferruccio Lamborghini. Story 57. Forget it, I'll do it myself, could have been Alexander the Great's motto. During the siege of a Malian stronghold on the Hydrotes River, around the Indus Valley during the Indian campaign, Alexander grew impatient with his troops trying to position the scaling ladders. So he grabbed one, climbed up first, and started fighting one against many. His bodyguards panicked and tried to climb up behind him, but they were heavily armored and armed. In their rush, they broke the ladder. Alexander realized he was stuck. He could remain exposed at the top and accomplish little, or he could hop down into the citadel's interior to carve out space for the Macedonians to climb over, join him, and open the gate. He chose the latter, continued to fight alone until some elite soldiers joined him. He took an arrow that pierced his lung, fought a bit longer, and collapsed. His soldiers protected him, opened the gate, and the siege succeeded. He survived the wound, but its long-term effects likely contributed to the illness that eventually killed him. This was not the only time he acted this way. Almost any assault on a city usually featured Alexander in the vanguard or on a special mission. He led a sneak attack at the siege of Syropolis in modern-day Tajikistan, through a gap in the walls created by a low river channel, and took a severe blow to the head. He challenged Darius, the Persian great king, to single combat at the Battle of the Granicus, where his helmet was damaged by a sword blow. That is just a portion of his exploits. Alexander was extraordinary. Story 58. Hopefully this will one day make history. Due to the lack of health care for my worsening genetic condition, I quit everything at 28 years old to study biology, genetics, and neuroscience to figure it out myself. Bonus: I actually enjoy it. Story 59. In 1988, famous Cleveland Indians slugger Pedro Cerrano had been troubled all year by opposing pitchers' curveballs. He had publicly turned to Jobu, a voodoo god, for help with his predicament, but it was ineffective. In the final game of the regular season, Cleveland was tied with the New York Yankees in a single game, winner-take-all affair to get into the playoffs. Late in the game, needing to score, Cerrano came to the plate and was quickly down 0-2 from 2 straight curveballs. This was the point where he changed his future. Stepping out of the box, Pedro began speaking to himself to hype himself up for the next pitch. But it was more than that. A ball boy standing nearby confirmed later in an interview that he was actually speaking to Jobu, and, while he didn't catch it all, he did hear, "Forget you, Jobu. I do it myself." What came next was the stuff of legends. Pedro hit the next curveball over the fence for a home run, and the team proceeded to win in dramatic fashion in the bottom of the 9th inning for their first division pennant and playoff appearance in more than 50 years. Story 60. A father shot his child's attacker while pretending to be on the phone. As the perpetrator walked by, he turned and shot him in the head. Good riddance. Story 61. The woman, who had a daughter with cancer, became a doctor and scientist researching cancer. Story 62. Neil Armstrong. When the landing program failed on the moon. Story 63. The Odone family. When their son was diagnosed with adrenoleukodystrophy, which had no effective treatments at the time, they developed one. This was made famous in the movie Lorenzo's Oil. Story 64. In 1984, Dr. Barry Marshall could not get funding for his research into ulcers because nobody took his theory that they are caused by Helicobacter pylori bacteria, not stomach acid or stress, seriously. He drank a slurry containing the bacteria, colonized his own stomach, and observed the results, which were the beginnings of ulcers, and supported his theories. After 2 weeks and 3 endoscopies, he started taking antibiotics. He won the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 2005. Story 65. Adrian Carton de Wyatt, a British soldier during the First World War, had at least 2 fingers mangled by shrapnel on one occasion. He withdrew from the front line, found a dressing station, and asked a doctor to remove his fingers. The doctor declined. He responded by forcefully pulling off his fingers and ran back to the trench. Story 66. China is building its own space station after being rejected by the United States from cooperation on the International Space Station. Story 67. In 2009, I had the stomach flu during my freshman year of college. I was about 6 hours from home, so I stayed in, only waking up to use the bathroom. The people in the dorm next to me were loudly complaining that they could not get their apple bomb to work. After what felt like an eternity of them complaining, probably 5 minutes, I searched for how to make an apple bong, grabbed an apple, made a solid apple bong, and gave it to my neighbors so they could be quiet. Story 68. Jean de Salis Longchamps escaped Nazi occupation in Belgium during World War II and joined the Royal Air Force. He proposed a mission to his commanders several times, but it was denied. Eventually, after completing an authorized mission, he sent his wingman home and flew 31 miles alone to carry out his unauthorized attack on the Gestapo headquarters in his hometown. Flying below rooftop level, he lined up on the building and took out a few dozen Nazis who had come to the windows to see what the noise was. He was both demoted and awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. Story 69. The Russian submariner ignored the alarm signaling that a nuclear warhead had been launched at Russia. He chose not to retaliate, thereby avoiding a nuclear war. He was right. Story 70. Audie Murphy comes to mind. Story 71. President Whitmore jumping in a fighter jet and defeating the aliens himself in Independence Day. Story 72. Henry Ford. The West did not recognize the Soviet Union as a nation when it was first formed, but Ford believed he could defeat communism through capitalism. He helped Joseph Stalin build a car factory in Russia. Ford brought Russian workers to the United States for training and sent American workers to train workers in Russia. This helped Russia enter the industrial age. Stalin called him the greatest industrialist, which is surprising considering how much of a capitalist Ford was. Story 73. Dashrath Manji. The man who carved a road through a mountain. The Jeller Hills are a low but treacherous spine of mountainous terrain that once divided the settlements and services on either side. Many villagers from Manji's town had to trek for miles around the hills just to reach their fields and schools. However, this changed with the tragic death of Manji's wife, Faguni Devi. Devi was traversing the narrow path across the tall hills to bring her husband some water when she was seriously injured. The nearest medical facility was over 40 miles away, and Devi perished shortly after her accident. Struck by his loss, Manji resolved to make sure such a tragedy never happened again. Taking up simple tools, he began chipping away at one of the hills, determined to create a road that would serve his village and others like it. Ridiculed by his fellow villagers and ignored by the government, Manji worked tirelessly on the road day after day, slowly but surely eroding a passage into the earth. In time, the locals came to respect his work as they saw its promise, and many began providing food and tools for the newly dubbed Mountain Man. After 22 years of backbreaking labor, Manji finished the 360-foot road in 1982. Tearing straight through the mountain, the road not only cut miles of travel for countless village travelers, it made traversing the area safer and allowed for small automobile traffic. The Mountain Man died in 2007, but the road that was the fruit of his labor still bears his name, an amazing testament to the power of the individual. Story 74. Maybe not the best per se, but Jim Bishop made and is making Bishop's Castle in southern Colorado pretty much only with his family. Bishop bought the land for the site for $450 when he was 15, and construction on what was originally intended to be a family project to build a cottage started in 1969. After Bishop surrounded the cottage with rocks, several neighbors noted that the structure looked something like a castle. Bishop took this into consideration and soon began building his castle. It is pretty big and has a wrought iron dragon that breathes fire at the top. Story 75. The Man Who Moved a Mountain by Himself. After 22 years, Dashrath Das built a road so that Atri could use it. Story 76. The Panama Canal and Theodore Roosevelt. He took decisive action to ensure its construction despite opposition. The world would be very different without that important trade route. Story 77. The men who went into Chernobyl to help protect against the material leaking into the groundwater. Story 78. Neil Armstrong took control from the landing computer when he saw it was guiding the Lunar Excursion Module to a boulder-filled landing zone. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.